Hey, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I work at IE Business School Publishing, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Do you have something you'd like some help with? Ask our guests. Go to professorgame.com/question and get your question answered in a future episode. Engagers, today we are with JD Dillon. JD, the first thing that we always want to make sure before we start our interviews is if our guests are prepared to engage. So are you?
I am as prepared as I can be.
That's the best that we can get, and I'm sure that's amazing and incredible for what we are looking for. So JD, that we have today, he is one of the most prolific authors and speakers in the workplace learning today. He has a practical approach that integrates science, technology, storytelling, and pure common sense to enable employees improve performance and drive business results. So for 20 years, he has executed strategies for global organizations like Walt Disney Company, Kaplan, Brambles, and AMC Theatres. He's currently the chief learning architect at Axonify, where he partners with award-winning team to solve business problems for leading organizations through modern world learning practices and cutting-edge technology. And of course, he is also the founder of LearnGeek, which provides advising and educational services. So JD, is there anything that we're missing that we perhaps should know about you?
I think that's way too much already from a bio perspective. But to summarize, I'm a corporate learning and operations person. So I've primarily spent my career with larger enterprises in North America, but now I work on the learning technology and solutions provider side of the world. So at least professionally, that's who I am professionally.
Fantastic, beautiful. So the first thing that we would like to know, JD, is what would a regular day, or some of our guests have answered the regular week, because the specific day is kind of hard to arrive to. What's your general day look like for JD? If we were to follow you through a full day, what will we find in general?
Yeah, I'm gonna opposite ends of the spectrum a little bit. So let's use today as one end of the spectrum. Today I'm sitting in my apartment all day, staring at a monitor, writing things, and joining the odd meeting here and there. So this is the downtime before the storm type, get the work done. So when I do preparations for speaking presentations, or I write articles for different outlets or my blog and things like that, or any of the kind of heads down type work that you need to do from a day-to-day perspective, that's kind of this week right now, generally speaking. I travel about 60% of my time. So on the other side of the spectrum, an average day, for example, last week when I was in Toronto, was running around the conference center, doing multiple presentations on different topics during a learning and development event, and then getting in a car and driving to the office, where I joined meeting to meeting because I'm rarely there in person because I work remotely. So I think the kind of bounces around a little bit. In a little bit, I'm about to start 3 weeks of travel. So I'll be bouncing around the United States and then heading across a large ocean to another continent for a little while to attend different events or, speak with some clients or prospects. So I bounce around a decent amount. So regular day I don't really have a consistency in that regard. But today is an example of the low energy, mildly relaxing, but head down focused type of a work day for me.
That's fantastic. That's interesting as well, because it gives you the variety in your life to be happy with what you're doing and to be able to do different things as well. I think that keeps life interesting in a way as well.
As long as you can balance it. Right?
Yes, definitely.
Right. Yep.
So JD, the first, deeper question that we always get into, and it's actually quite a deep one, and it's about failure. It's about a story that perhaps you could tell us about a time when something that perhaps, not to frame it just as failure or a fail of first attempt in learning, but perhaps a failure or a fail that you ran into and that, you would call maybe your favorite failure because it taught you many things or led you to future success. Can you tell us a story when you were building some learning product, especially if it had some gamification involved, which I know is something that you do a lot as well? That's the main stories that we're looking after.
Sure, I would say it's a little bit of a wider perspective when I think of kind of what's my most meaningful moment of failure. And it wasn't specifically related to me as much it was the function in the organization with which I was working at that time. Okay. So with a previous employer, I was doing a lot of hands-on content development work. And let's just say it was what you would typically see when you're talking about e-learning development. So a lot of information, 15, 20, 30-minute long modules, a lot of click next to continue type activity. And a lot of it was focused on very timely product releases, the types of things that we build one and done e-learning for. And
that sounds like the kind of thing that the click next to continue is the typical thing that got e-learning its bad name in a way.
Yeah, exactly, right. And this is kind of one of those stories. So we were doing things that way because that was pretty much what I knew to do. Coming out of operations and going into learning development was a very steep and incremental learning curve. So I didn't come into this game with a solid understanding of learning science principles, with a ton of background and experience in education or teaching or anything to that effect. I was an operator who had a certain skill set that eventually turned me into a learning and development professional. So I spent a decent amount of time kind of working my way through the weeds of where do I fit and how does what I do help other people do things. So I think I was always well-intentioned, but I was basically following the lead of where others were going and what I thought was the right thing to do. So,
sorry, JD, just to make sure I didn't mean it in any way. I think most of us have been there at some point, and it's fantastic that you're coming up with this story as well.
Oh yeah. I don't think it's unfamiliar. I think a lot of people probably either been there before, been there, or are there right now. But in my case, so I was with an organization for about 6 months. We were doing this type of work. I mean, we were not wanting for things to do, right? Always very busy. They need it tomorrow type of world. So again, a kind of a familiar e-learning development shop. And what happened was I came into work one day and suddenly found out that just give or take 40% of the company was getting laid off that day. Oof. And I was newer to the organization. I didn't have enough influence or kind of a position by which I would get a heads up with that regard, in that regard to something that was happening of that scale in an organizational restructure. But what hit me, because I wasn't personally impacted, my team wasn't personally impacted because we were already kind of a small and mighty team, but it was my audience, the people that I was there to help, were impacted. And I've always been in this field because I have a desire to help people do what they like to do better. That's the reason I work in learning at all. So that was a moment, the first time that I started to question, what's my value in this organization and to these people if I couldn't stop this from happening? And by no means do I think training was the problem, or I couldn't personally have made the organization successful to a point where that would not have taken place. But it forced me to rethink the ways that I was doing things as related to what was happening in the business and my ability to keep pace with that type of change. And the fact that the next time it shouldn't be a surprise to me. I should know that the struggle is happening because I should be struggling too. And I should be trying to fix whatever the problem is early enough that it doesn't come to the point where someone's going to lose their job and have to go home and tell their family that they have a problem now. And I'm one of these people who I don't believe there are business decisions. I believe they're all people decisions. So that's the way I generally look at this type of an activity in an organization. So even though I wasn't personally impacted, I was lucky in that regard. It hit me hard enough to make me look at everything my team was doing and say, there's a different way, because something's fundamentally disconnected between how we're spending our day and what's happening to the people inside of the operation. And that really kickstarted my shift in approach and mindset in terms of how I do what I do. And the things that I talk about today are all born from that general moment in time. I was already heading down a certain path. I hadn't finished. I wasn't, solid or kind of settled with the way that I was doing what I was doing and, the role I had at the time. But it really jump-started that level of reflection and analysis to say, what's the relationship between my work and the people who are on the front line working with the customer every day? And how do I make sure everything that I'm doing is in support of them? And fundamentally, since then, I've changed the way that I look at workplace learning as a support structure for those people who are doing the job every day.
Wow, that's really, really powerful, JD. And I wanted to break in here, especially because I was seeing it very clearly in my mind when you were telling this final section, especially how this relates directly to the way we also see education. I mean, as teachers, as professors, what are we teaching our students? Are we teaching them something that will be useful for them, that will impact their lives, their professional lives, their personal lives? Many of us are. Many people are doing something that is directly impacting. But those who are not, don't be afraid of of the future. Think about how you can do something and how it can be more integrated and more useful and more engaging to what your audience, your students are doing. And you don't need to go into such a hard moment as JD had, as seeing all these people get laid off to have that aha moment. You can have it right now. You can say, well, I heard JD in the podcast and I realized that might be something similar in a way to what I'm seeing in my class, and I want to change. I want to do things differently. I want to be more useful to my students in a certain way. Whatever it is that you feel you could do better and that you could improve to approach your profession and the way that you're doing things and the way you're being useful and powerful to your students. Maybe it's a time to think about it, to rethink many of the things that you're doing and to get into, for example, things like gamification that could be helping you in that path. So thank you very much for that story, JD. I think it was very, very powerful. Is there any key takeaway that you would like to leave us with as well?
I think with regards to that story, it's just the understanding that I think we're in a lucky position if you're in learning, education, whatnot, to be able to try to help someone be successful in whatever they're trying to do. So I think it's making sure that we understand that we have to fit into their reality and that their failure reflects on us in the majority of cases. There are obviously things we can't control, things we can't impact, but I think there's a stronger connection there than a lot of people maybe give credit for or notice. So it's really, especially in workplace learning, it's about us fitting how we do what we do into other people's reality, because without them, we don't exist, rather than making them come to us. So that was really the big takeaway for me and what really started to shape the way I thought about the type of work that I do inside of an organization.
Beautiful. So JD, let's take a 180-degree spin and actually talk about something that, it could have started as a failure or it could have been just a blast from the beginning, but something that you could say is a big challenge that you faced, or something that was difficult and challenging that you had, and you actually solved it using all these gamification and these techniques that we've been learning in the past years. Tell us that story, or something you can be proud of in that regard that you would like to, I don't know, show off even.
Sure. I'd say I'll go back to what I would define as kind of my first foray or exploration of gamification or game mechanics within a workplace learning context. And this takes me back to my time at Disney. And I first got into learning and development from a formal perspective, because it's been in and out of my career, from an HR and operations perspective, pretty much my entire life. But I formally stepped into learning and development roles for the first time as a career path with Disney. And I was attached to a project where we were basically launching a rebrand of customer service standards at the world's most renowned customer service organization. So there was a lot of delivery, a very large audience, a very small time to execute, because obviously we want to turn around now because of what Disney is known for. So I spent a considerable amount of time in a classroom facilitating classes for all potential types of audiences across a resort property like Walt Disney World. And what it led me down the path was trying to look at ways that we could better contextualize what customer service, or in this case, the terminology would be guest service, meant to people who were working these different types of roles. Because while the standards are consistent across different types of jobs, being a housekeeper is a very different reality than being a lifeguard, which is a very different reality than being an executive, ... So how do we understand the realities and day-to-day of these people in these types of jobs and help them say, well, how do I bring the expectations of Disney into my role? And it was the first time I started going down the path of the power of story. So how do I make it not just useful, but interesting, exciting, fun for someone to spend time in a room with me or a member of my team talking about customer service standards at the world's biggest customer service organization, where you in your onboarding training and during your job training, this has already been talked to you, but how do we bring it to life in a more meaningful way? So what we did was we started to go down the path of building these short instructor-led events, because that was the only real medium we had to use at the time, and wrapping them in customized stories that really met the needs of the particular organization. So the one that really kickstarted things for me was we were opening an attraction at the theme park Epcot called Kim Possible World Showcase Adventure. And it was the first project I was formally attached to as a lead with regards to looking at a new environment and defining kind of how we're going to train people when it comes to delivering the best possible guest service. So it was a unique attraction and involved walking around with RFID-enabled phones and interactive environments in the landscape of the park, and working with Kim Possible to solve a mission, with one of the supervillains from the animated show that was on the air at the time. So what we did was we actually created our own version of it. The entire instructor-led event was wrapped in a story where we created a supervillain. It was a little bit hokey, if you think about it, but this supervillain was there to destroy the customer service at the park. We costumed up a member of my team who was previously in entertainment and friends with a variety of interesting people that you might think about visiting at a theme park that are of certain heights. And we wrote this story about how you could, as a cast member, apply these different things you were learning about customer service in order to incrementally defeat this villain over a series of challenges, all taking place in a customer service environment, and ultimately come out of there with different sets of behaviors that you could use day to day in the park with guests. And what was interesting was we had never tried something like this before. I hadn't seen anything like this before. It was kind of a shot in the dark with regards to applying these different types of game mechanics and driven through story in an instructor-led training. Obviously, at Disney, we're hugely known for using story, but this is a different way to do it. And what was interesting was not only did we get great level 1 scores and people reflecting on it as a positive experience, but when we went back into the park, we started to see people using certain things that they came up with in the room. So certain theming, certain phrases, certain ways of interacting with people that were created as part of the activities inside the room to combat this mock villain, were then lifted directly by the cast members into the park and showing up inside of their interactions with guests every day. And we were getting the behavior change in the park that we wanted to see. So it was relatively simple subject matter in terms of how to interact with people, but wrapping it in a story, wrapping it in challenges, and kind of reframing how we were using a classic instructor-led training with group activities and things like that, but making it much more appropriate for this audience in this type of job, in this unique story-driven environment, really started to open my eyes to the power of story if contextualized appropriately to a particular environment. So it was the first time that I really applied what I would refer to as different types of game mechanics in a training activity, and it started to shape the way that I did different things with Disney. And then once I left Disney, kind of borrowing the best pieces from that, even to today, the way I use story and different things that I do is reflective of those moments several years ago now in that environment. So I think that was the first time I really went down that path, and it was the first kind of test run on what would this start to look like and how could I use these different ideas borrowed from the environment in which I was working. I didn't say, this is gamification at that time. It was more... just kind of looking at the environment, the type of experience people were having in the park, what the attraction actually was, and just borrowing the pieces from it. And now years later, looking back, I can sit there and say, well, that was progress, that was challenge, this is story, this is character, ... I just happened to bring them all together from a different perspective.
Definitely, that's a very powerful story. You can see there how JD turned things around and used the environment and used an appropriate theme. Many, many, many learnings from this, JD. Thank you for that story. It's been I've definitely taken in many of the learnings that you had. Again, if you have a 30-second pitch of anything that you would like to leave us with, please go ahead.
I think it really comes back to, one, the power of story and the fact that we don't always have to tell people what to do or just push information at people. Helping people discover through a story that is relevant to them, that makes sense, that's well constructed, and oh, by the way, that can be fun. People can find the value and the meaning and adopt those things appropriately if we craft the kind of the context and the environment correctly. So I think it's just looking at there are multiple ways to get people to raise the insights themselves, or reflect, and start to shift their own behavior without us just simply telling people what to do. It's not always the right tool to use, but I think it's a powerful tool to use because it allows people to internalize and intrinsically motivate change, as opposed to being distinctly told, do this or else.
Indeed. And JD, talking of these things and how you've restructured your way of approaching these learning experiences, would you say that you follow some sort of process? Or is there any, I don't know, it could be structured, not too structured, but what do you do when you confront a learning situation, a learning experience that you want to craft? What are maybe the steps you follow? How do you approach a situation like this one? Can you give us a sneak peek into your process?
Sure. I'd say it's less a process and more just kind of a consistent set of sensibilities. Fundamentally, trying to understand the reality of the people that I'm trying to help. So as my jobs change and I do different types of things, I'm further and further removed from the day-to-day reality of the people I'm trying to help. Especially working, on the learning technology and solution side of the fence, I'm not part of the companies that I typically speak with, or when I speak at conferences, I don't know the realities of the day-to-day for the audience. I think I'm lucky in the fact that I came out of an operational environment and spent a considerable amount of time as management in frontline capacities in very high volume, safety critical type customer service environments. So I have a grounding to what it is like to be a manager and a frontline employee in those worlds. And I consistently apply that sensibility in what I do, but I spend significant amount of time getting as close as I can. So if I'm working with an organization who is a retailer, as an example, I'm spending time in the stores. I'm spending time alongside the actual employees. I'm not just being walked through a store with executives who are telling me how things should be. I'm actually engaged in conversations and involving the people who do the job as much as possible in whatever the work we're doing is. And I think that, again, was ingrained in me back at Disney because mostly out of just demand and the needs of the parks. If we were in learning and development, as an example, we literally, at one point, I had an office under the Magic Kingdom because there's a tunnel system under the Magic Kingdom. We would literally come out from underground and go back into the parks and support them during their busiest times. Because during, example, the week of Christmas, there's nothing going on from a non-operational perspective, right? No one's going to a training class. We're not onboarding anybody. It's all hands on deck in the operation. So we would, from support teams, return back into the operation. And I, in some cases, would put costuming back on because I came into Disney as a frontline cast member. So I would go back into the frontline costumes that you see in a Disney park and work in whatever capacity I could in the front line to, one, be of assistance to the operation, but two, get closer to the people doing the job every day because I can then hear what they're talking about and see through their experience what it's like to try to do these jobs so that next time I come back and I'm trying to do something from a training perspective, I can appreciate and understand what their reality is like and then design something in partnership with them that's closer to what their actual need is than if I was sitting in an office somewhere being told by a subject matter expert and having to assume that that's completely accurate. So doing whatever you can do to get as close to the reality and the context of the everyday of the people you're supporting and then involving them as much as you can in your process, I think is only beneficial. So I'd say when it comes to anything I do, that's kind of first and foremost is I need to understand what their day-to-day is like. Otherwise, I can't make the right recommendation or create the right solution because I could completely miss because I'm not them. I'm not doing the job.
Okay. And is there anything else that you do right after receiving all that sensibility? That's that understanding, in a way, it's understanding your users and not only who they are, but where they're at currently, I'm guessing. Is there anything else that you typically do right after you do that? Or is it a case by case depending on the situation?
There's a decent amount of variety after that. I think the other thing that I'm a considerable fan of is starting small but thinking big, not trying to solve all of the world's problems or all of an organization's problems in one foul swoop. Taking a look at the organization, maybe getting a sense of what the larger problems are, but seeing can we solve or address that problem in a particular part of the business with a particular team and prove our value and build our business case and then build up. I'm a huge fan of organic kind of evolution of idea inside of an organization rather than coming top down and pushing onto the organization, getting the people on the front lines, the frontline management team, to be proponents and to see that something works, and to use them and their words to sell my case, as opposed to pushing something down on top of them. So I'm a big fan of testing, prototyping, getting in, trying something quick, failing quickly, and then iterating fast in order to find the right thing through trial and error, as opposed to spend all the time, all the money, try it once, completely miss, that was a waste, and now you've broken your trust and you can't try something the next time. So I think when you understand the audience and then you try things based on their perspective, you can find, and I have several projects in my background where we found something worked unexpectedly and were able to pivot and go in that direction because the audience was taking us there, rather than me try to have a grand strategy. I remember once I actually started writing a document at one point and it said social learning strategy at the top. And I never wrote anything else on that page because I very quickly realized that's not a thing. I can't plan how people are going to interact and share information. I have to get into the world, see how they're actually doing it, and find small ways that I can start to improve it until I ultimately get to a place that it actually feels strategic in nature. So I tend to approach things a little more from that perspective, as opposed to having the grand plan and let's do everything. I may come with a set of principles and kind of help shape a larger vision. That's why I always say start small. Let's solve one particular problem, address one thing, but the whole time be thinking that bigger picture. So how am I going to take what I just did for one team and scale this to all of the teams later? So you keep that in mind so that you don't ultimately run into a wall that you built for yourself and you can't get beyond it.
That makes a lot of sense, JD. Engagers, just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you have been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you could share it with your friends and family and on social media. Thanks in advance for your engagement. So now we are going to get started in what we like to call the second part of our interview, by lack of a better name to this date. And in here, we're going to go more into tips, tactics, and less into stories and full, like the last question that we had about the full process that you follow. And from that process, I gathered a couple of things that I think you will be saying that are your best practices, or something that almost any gamification for learning project could benefit from. Do you want to say them again, or is there something else you would like to add as a best practice?
I'd say the biggest thing that comes to mind for me when you specifically look at gamification or the game mechanics within learning is not focusing on the word gamification or the tactics themselves, and instead thinking about motivation and people's behavior. Because when you focus on what you're trying to get people to do and why you need them to do it, and again, ground it in the reality of what people are actually doing, I find you're more open to potential tools, tactics, and ideas, rather than sitting there saying, I need leaderboards to work. We're going to insert a leaderboard. Do you actually fundamentally understand how people interact in this organization, what this culture does? Are people competitive? Does it motivate the individuals to compete in some way? And then back your way into a tactic in order to support the way motivation's already playing out inside of an organization. So for me,
that's what we like to call good gamification, not starting with just a mechanic, or the boss or the principal of the school saw a racing car game, so we have to do something with cars and races and a leaderboard and all these themes. It's growing organically from what actually you're observing in your class, from what your topics are, from the other things that come up, and not the other way around. So I completely agree with you, JD. That's actually the place to start.
Yeah, as a technology provider that works in gamification, because Axonify, we have a gamified solution that we work with through organizations. There's an inordinate amount of times where someone comes to the table and says they're looking for gamification, but when they're asked why, they can't answer the question, because it's either buzzy, they've heard it, they saw someone else doing it. But I'm a huge fan of a proponent of the fact that because it worked somewhere else doesn't mean it's going to work here. They might have good ideas and principles we can lift over here. Obviously, the technology used over there may work over here, but the way that you apply it within your organization, with your people and your culture, may shift. So I'd be very excited if someone came to me one day and said, I've done a lot of research into what motivates our people and our culture, and we found that and then lead me to the path of why points are a good idea. Because points can work, I just need that whole backstory. So doing that research and making the effort to understand the fundamental principles behind something like gameplay makes gameplay more successful.
And talking of gameplay, JD, what would you say is your favorite game?
So right now, so you caught me at a particular moment in time. So I am not a giant game player per se, various types of games. I'm mildly competitive, but I have a relatively short ability to stay focused on something for a period of time. So every day I do actually play a certain set of games. So I have two apps on my phone that involve gameplay. One's Axonify. So for the last 4.5 years, I've played an Axonify game every day. And then one is one of those kind of common brain training type applications that I don't particularly believe in, but I kind of like the games. So I just play the games. I don't actually pay attention to any of the mechanics around it that's supposed to tell me how my attention's improving or anything to that degree. So I typically wake up in the morning and I play both of those games, sets of games, and that particularly helps me kind of focus and get started in the day. So I tend to do that. It's interesting you caught me now because I'm fully immersed in the Spider-Man universe right now.
Wow.
So I
Spider-Man fan over here.
I recently acquired a PlayStation. I have not purchased a video game console in a long time, but I'm a hockey fan. There's a new hockey game coming out. I watch a lot of YouTube. So I got to the point where I was watching people play a video game on YouTube, and I said to myself, I should just buy the game. So I acquired a PlayStation. It's opposite my Blu-ray player, right? So it's multifunctional. And then the Spider-Man game was released from Marvel, and I said, I like Spider-Man. It's getting great reviews. I should get the Spider-Man game. So I have, for the first time in my life, just finished a game.
Wow.
So because I usually play for a little while, and then I get tired of it or I get distracted, and I never really come back. In this case, I charged through. The game's been out at this point, I think, for maybe 2 weeks-ish. I was fully committed this past weekend to defeating the villains, getting to the end of the story. It's an awesome game. I'm now playing the part of friendly neighborhood Spider-Man on a regular basis, just swinging around New York City, stopping random crimes because the story's over. But I'm committed to my role, protecting the neighborhood in Manhattan. But no, it's been an interesting experience because just as a person with my background and what I do, I'm enjoying the experience as a gamer, but at the same time, I'm looking at the way they're telling the story, the mechanics, the ease of use, the fact that it feels so fluid to play the game as a person with not a ton of button mashing experience. I couldn't tell you where on a PlayStation controller the different shapes are right now at all, but I can play that game without a problem. So I'm fascinated by just the design of the instruments around the way they're telling the story. So it's been very interesting for me in that regard. I tend to be talking a lot more about that and less about the particular ways I'm powering up the different suits. But they're cool too. So that currently is where my focus is. And I'm very curious because I know they're going to release additional campaigns in the near future. So I may be in the Spider-Verse for a little while.
I've been in that one since my dad showed me the first comic. So I don't have the game, at least yet. But I've been in that universe for quite a while. But JD, we would like to know now if there's anybody that you maybe look up to or would like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game.
So I think the person I would refer to is the person I know you've already had on the show. So that whenever I talk about gamification or anything related to games and learning, I tend to basically say I'm borrowing all of my ideas from Carl Komp.
Yes.
So I know he's been on the show, but I'll just reiterate the fact that if you're interested in this concept at all, whether it's in formal education, workplace learning, any type of environment, he is my go-to, and then everything kind of springs out from Carl. He's also a great guy on top of being very knowledgeable in his field. So that's the first person that comes to mind when it comes specifically to the ideas of game-based learning, gamification, and whatnot.
Definitely. And Carl, as JD was saying, he's episode 25. So if you want to take a look at what Carl said, if you haven't already, or if you want to have a refresher, you just go to Professor Game and look for episode 25 or type Carl with a K, and you can find his episode as well. And in that same vein, and I have a suspicion of what your answer could be here, what book would you recommend to this audience, to the engagers?
So I would say, I literally turned around and I'm staring at a bookshelf right now to make an informed decision. So it would be a bit of a cop out to say Carl's book. That was pun intended, if anyone caught that. But so I won't go there. I would say, staring with my head tilted sideways so I can read the spines of the books on my shelf. The one that I think I completed most recently is a book called The Power of Habit. And the reason I bring that up is because, one, I tend to talk about the idea of establishing habit or routine around learning in the workplace, because we often get so busy with doing the job that we don't take a time to actually focus on building our knowledge and skill. And we wonder why people fall behind and they don't have time to go to training and these types of things. So a lot of my work is wrapped around this idea of establishing learning as a structured habit in your day, dedicating those 5 minutes of time to, or maybe in this case, listening to the show for X number of minutes to help you get a little bit better piece by piece at your job. And I think when you talk about game mechanics and gamification, I think those are critical elements potentially in helping to shape that habit. So I think having a better understanding of how habits are developed, kind of how you establish cues to establish routines that ultimately change behavior. I think I in practice, I've applied gamification, game tactics to help people, focus, get engaged, shift their attention in such a way to try to foster these different habits that ultimately help them learn, get better at their job. So I think it's a meaningful way that we can apply game mechanics around the experience of work, so that people can shift.
JD, what would you say in that same regard? You were talking about precisely habits. It could be habits, or it could be something else, a creation of habits or similar, or maybe the stories. But what would you say is your superpower when you create these learning experiences?
Let's see. We're all wrapping around Spider-Man at this point. The entire episode
it could be the spider sense as well.
Should be themed to Spider-Man. I should have this answer top of mind. I'd say my particular superpower is, for lack of a better term, common sense. I think I tend to be a person who tries to be as practical and realistic as possible when we're talking about these type of topics. So I get frustrated when we overcomplicate the ideas of learning and helping people get better. I tend to say things like learning is infinitely complex, but much less complicated than we make it. Because I think we can do simpler things to help people, and they don't always have to be grand strategies, grand learning plans, right? These things that show off how smart we are and how well-versed we are in our craft, when you could have just written it down and handed the person a piece of paper and that would have done it. So I think the common sense and practicality of my approach, I think, is kind of what I try to rest my brand on. So I would say that's my preferred superpower.
Remember again that sometimes complicating solutions is the worst thing that you can do. And there was a chat of Andrzej Marchewski, I don't know if you've heard of him, JD, in Gamification Europe last year, where he was talking about solutioneering. So it's the creation of solutions for problems that are not there, that have never existed. So you're creating a solution for something that is not a problem yet, or will maybe never be a problem. And I guess it has the same vein in that sense of creating something grand when what you need is something perhaps very simple in that sense.
Agree completely.
So JD, this is the last sort of actual question of the interview, and it has a gamification element, which is randomness, because you don't know which is the question that is going to come up. I reviewed them beforehand. And the question today is from an English teacher. This person says, I am an English teacher and have seen many apps for learning languages that have gamification. We could always cite the typical example of Duolingo. That's just me talking. But then this person says, how can I do this kind of thing or something similar in my actual class of English to take advantage of gamification? I'm guessing that this is English as a second language. But do you have any thoughts on that you could bring up, JD?
Literally, the first thing that comes to mind is, why don't you just use Duolingo? So, right? I think, again, when you speak about what's out there and what can help, obviously, it might not complete or fit all of your needs, but I'd say a lot of my career is based on looking at ideas other people successfully applied in their context and borrowing the pieces that best fit my context. I consistently go on the record as saying I've borrowed Wikipedia and YouTube to no end in a variety of different projects because of the familiarity of that experience to solve problems, in everyday life. So if you're curious about how to be as successful in applying these ideas as the other thing. One, can you use the other thing rather than recreate the wheel if it's there? And again, I'm not a teacher, so I don't understand the potential complexities around this. But can you shape curricula around a Duolingo, or can you integrate Duolingo into your curricula in such a way where it acts as a reinforcement activity, or allows people to work ahead in these types of ideas? As long as I'm assuming that Duolingo might not get as complex in certain cases that you can in a room in fluid conversation. But is there an integration point where you can use that as a tool, given the fact that it's free and the majority of people in most environments have some type of a device that can access a Duolingo? So one, can you do that? Two, if you engage in Duolingo yourself and you get enough of an understanding of why it's successful, there's also a lot of research out there, reports, articles about apps like Duolingo that speak to why they are constantly referred to as the example of certain things. Are there elements of that you can borrow instead of making gamification have to be a technologically enabled, fully constructed strategy? Are there certain ways to just put in progress checks, right, to help people understand where they are in a journey? Reinforcement, right? Light amounts of rewards and recognition.
The habits that you were talking about before as well.
Yeah, the idea of doing something every day, right? As students tend to cram and do everything at one time to get the test passed, but a Duolingo allows you to pace in a way that better fits you versus what a traditional academic curriculum may do. So can you learn from those elements and introduce pieces of that into your teaching strategy and incrementally change rather than try to go from 0 to 100 right away with a big plan and not hit the mark? So I think those are the first things that come to mind for me with that type of a question.
Beautiful. So finally, we would like to know if you have any final piece of advice, JD, before we take off.
Sure. So I think, I spoke a lot about getting to understand the context of your user and the environment in which things will be applied and really understanding the day-to-day. So I think I completely agree with folks who say that when it comes to learning, teaching, whatnot, we have a lot that we can learn from folks who do other types of work, including game designers. Like I said, playing Spider-Man, I'm fascinated by the way that they helped me play Spider-Man, and thinking about, as someone who works in the technology field, how can applications that I work with be as fluid and useful as that experience was for me, knowing that I'm also not the end user target and it's not the same context, but starting to think in that way. So I think there's that. And then when it comes to things like gamification, game mechanics, there's still a lot of buzz and hype. Now we're near as much as 5+ years ago where it was going to solve all of our problems.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah, now I think people are starting to have more informed conversations because it didn't solve all of our problems, but people found meaningful success here and there. So it's becoming a more informed conversation. So I'd say, don't necessarily second guess or look down on different concepts, even when people say gamification is not just points, badges, and leaderboards. Well, there actually is value in points, badges, and leaderboards if you use them well. So it comes down to fundamentally understanding that what's behind them. Why would anyone care about a badge? And coming from that perspective, rather than thinking badges are inherently a good idea. So as long as you do that work, and there's plenty of information out there from folks like Carl and other folks that I think, when I looked at your show list, everyone I've ever referenced in gamification, I think, is on your roster. So if you listen to this show, I think you'll pick up a lot of this. But just recognizing that the information's out there and just paying attention to your day-to-day. When people fight me on the gamification topic and say, it won't work here, I tend to ask them, do you go to Starbucks? Do you have a rewards card? How's that working for you? Because people actually have game mechanics wrapped around their day-to-day lives. They just don't know.
Do you like sports? Do you play with your kids? I mean, there's so many questions to bring up when people say those kinds of things.
Yeah, I labor over airline miles all the time. I'm stuck in their motivational mechanics to use their particular airline. So just paying attention to your day-to-day and realizing that these bits and pieces are out there. And if you pay a little bit more attention, kind of focus down on how these mechanics are influencing consumer behavior, I think there's pieces that you can lift that'll feel familiar and can be applied in whatever context you're trying to apply it.
That's it. So finally, JD, is there, can you tell us where we can find more about you, where we can connect with you, and then we'll say it's game over?
Sure. I'm heavily on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is at JD_Dillon, Dillon. And my website is LearnGeek.co. That's a .co at the end, or Axonify.com.
Fantastic. Thank you once again for your time, JD, for all the knowledge pills and full meals that we got today. But now it's time for us to say goodbye, and now it's time to say game over.
Thanks for inviting me to play.
Engagers, it's fantastic to have you around. This podcast only makes sense with you. Let's connect on Twitter so you can let me know who would you like to have as a guest, what questions you have, what we can help you with. Find my Twitter account in professorgame.com/Twitter. I'm always sharing content on gamification, especially around education. Hey, don't click continue yet. Do you want to know what Karen has learned from the creation of location-based games? Then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.